So welcome to our first discussion of Kant, our first ever discussion of Kant. I'm going to share online the handout that we all have. And our focus is going to be this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, which is about 880 pages in the second edition. So we're not going to cover the whole book. The main purpose is to try and understand Kant's problem and the strategy that he uses to solve the problem. And this is not the focus of most of the scholarship. I don't know how much of the scholarship you've unfortunately had to trawl through in order to pass PH 203 or whatever. I've read a little bit because I studied Kant as an undergrad across the road and as a graduate student in Boston with Henry Allison, who's one of the more recognisable names in the scholarship, not on the street. And he writes 800 pages about each chapter of, he's written 5 major books, and they all take certain sections of the deduction of the categories or something and examine them in minute detail. There's an enormous amount of very boring Kant scholarship. Kant himself can be tedious. He can write very powerfully, and the reason why we're reading him is because he recognises the major problem of the Enlightenment and attempts to address it squarely. So it's with an amazingly comprehensive intelligence. That's part of his achievement. Now that's just the door. Okay. Now,
excuse me, who was the scholar?
Henry Allison. I meant that. Yeah. So he wants to defend Kant's position as the true position.
Like against Hegel.
Yes, yeah. And against Paul Guyer and Robert Pippin and and all these other little people. Yeah. Yes. Now, so I've got on the first page of this handout a rough sketch of what might be a schedule. So today, the main purpose today, and the main purpose of the course is to read Kant together and discuss what it might mean. That's so not my interpretation or other people's interpretation, just to read Kant. Now, I am definitely, by selecting certain passages and commenting on them, I will be giving you my interpretation. I welcome your interpretation and your critique of my bias, my prejudices. And what I want to do is mostly read Kant together. On the last day, I might make a more extended critical remark. And I think the main utility if there's any utility in my teaching this course, it's because I come from being more in favour of Plato and Aristotle, and so I can provide a contrast. Whereas if you understand Plato and Aristotle after Kant, that is after Hegel, after the revolution in philology that Hegel inaugurated, you don't understand Plato and Aristotle. So what we're taught as undergrads about Plato and Aristotle comes through these various filters, and it has no strong relation. No worries. Yeah. Is there a spare handout still floating around? There's no very strong relation between what, say, Plato and Aristotle are doing and the way they're taught in the textbooks. Now, every scholar of every great philosopher would say that. They would say that if they're a scholar of Francis Bacon or Galileo or whoever, they would say that. And because there's some truth to that. Textbooks have to summarise, simplify, and therefore get things wrong. It's just the nature of the things. Okay, but that's our focus. Read as much Kant as we can together. Maybe on the last day we'll be more critical. So if we go to the second page, just a couple of extremely boring philological details. So
Martin, could you enlarge the screen, please?
Enlarge the screen.
Thank you.
Is that visible?
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's much better.
Okay.
Much better.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for letting me know that, Peter. Okay, there's a standard German edition. If you happen to be fluent in German, I've got a link to the German edition of Kant's works in the Prussian Academy edition, which is the main one. Now, in English, there is now a standard English translation of almost all the works of Kant. It's the Cambridge edition of the works of Immanuel Kant. And it's their translation of the Critique of Pure Reason by Paul Guyer and Alan Wood that I'm using. And I've made this book, available through that link, which goes to, I forget if it's Dropbox or Proton Drive, one of the two. So if you want to download that and if you want to read that independently, if you don't have your own copy of the Critique of Pure Reason lying around. Now, just for references, all of the works of Kant are usually referred to by the title, say, Prolegomena, to any metaphysics that comes forth as a science. And people will say Prolegomena, and then put the German edition volume and the German edition page number after that, which would be Prolegomena, volume 4, so 4:25. And that German edition page number should be in the margins of any decent English translation. So you can follow citations. The one exception is for the Critique of Pure Reason, and I'll just mention now, so there's in 1781, the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason came out, and the second edition came out in 1787, and they are now referred to as the A and B edition. So page numbers refer to CPR or KRV, and then A25/B42. So again, the English translation has these has the first and second edition page numbers in the margins. There is a slight complication, is that some changes in the first half of the book, some major changes were made, nothing in the second half, minor things in the second half. And we're going to have to deal with that to a small degree. My thought is today we will look at some passages from the first preface, the A preface, and some passages from the B preface. And the B preface is very helpful because Kant thought that he had solved all the major problems of philosophy with the first edition. And yet there were some reluctant people who refused to believe him. So in the preface to the second edition, he summarized what he thought he was doing. And that's extremely helpful for us who are trying to make our way into the labyrinth. Okay, so I have a very small chart of dates on the bottom of page 2. Now, for me, there's 3 important dates. 1, first edition, 1781. 2, the second edition. And 3, the French Revolution. Okay. Now, people who were writing at the time for Enlightenment were writing for things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but they were writing to some degree carefully about that, because you don't want to get executed, right? And when the revolution begins, then you have to adopt a new ideology if you don't want to be executed. And that paradigm is extremely helpful for understanding what Kant is doing. He's so much more radical than he appears often to Henry Allison, right? Henry Allison is fascinated by Kant's notion of how we understand what a thing is. And he's written 7,000 pages about that. But the whole point of that is to eliminate the very possibility of there being knowledge of a God or gods or principles that surpass sensible experience, with one exception, which is universal moral principles. Right? But everything else is out. All of Plato is out, all of Aristotle is out, all of Aquinas is out. And it's very radical. He's not saying, what he's not doing is being concerned about how we identify a cat. Now, he has to explain that, and his explanation is extremely complicated, and we're going to read a few paragraphs. Actually, he uses the example of a dog and the schematism of the imagination, and we'll look at that, because if you can't explain our ability to recognize a dog, then you've failed as a philosophy of the human phenomena. Right? So he has to do that, but that's not the point. The point is this critique of metaphysics. And it's very parallel, like you can't have the critique of metaphysics without having a political, to use Spinoza's phrase, a theologico-political understanding. Those two things go together, and they go together in the first paragraph of the first preface, as we'll see in a few minutes. So this is extremely, the fact that he uses the metaphor in the first paragraph of the first edition, he uses the metaphor of metaphysics as being a dethroned queen. A couple of years later, we have an executed queen and king, right? These things they're not accidentally metaphorical analogies. There are deep correlations between what are apparently abstruse metaphysical and epistemological discussions and practical philosophico-theologico effects. That's my suggestion. Other people read Kant very differently. I point this out. No worries. Do we have any more pieces of paper?
We can share.
You do need the 84-page handout. Otherwise, actually, I'll just say this once now. So at the bottom of the first page is a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So if you want to know what the current scholarship is on Kant, on the transcendental deduction in the Critique of Pure Reason, or Kant on morality, there are respected scholars voluminously cited, lots of reference to other articles that are helpful through that site, and that will give you what's currently thought and what's currently being argued about. Which I'm going to ignore all of that because I'm not reading any of the scholarship. I'm just reading Kant as opposed to Aristotle or something. Okay, so to get a sense of what Kant is doing, if we go to page 3. Now, I wrote a couple of somewhat rhetorical paragraphs, which I'll summarise as follows. Normally, when people, when you attend, say, an undergraduate philosophy course, philosophers in the tradition will be understood in the light of whatever the current technique is. If it's ordinary language, analytical philosophy, or if it's Derridean deconstructionism, whatever it is, you understand the previous thinkers in the light of the current ones, which means, of course, you don't understand the previous ones. The second way of teaching them is to have a topic: metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, political philosophy, or something. Ethics. Ethics is now the big thing in philosophy. Ethics is the only, you call it sustainable or money-making part of philosophy departments. Why is that? Because philosophy is no longer taken seriously as a comprehension of the whole of human existence. But we somehow recognise that we are no longer immediately attached to principles that should guide our conduct. So teach the undergrads some ethics and everything will be fine. Now, if you understand that particular topic, then you're doing two things. You're accepting the division of human existence into various disciplines and into various aspects. For example, the way Kant divides up philosophy of nature and philosophy of morality has proved extremely influential. Right? So we have philosophy of science and ethics in a way that's completely denied by philosophers in the tradition. So if you do that, if you say, well, this is going to be a course on epistemology and this is Plato's contribution and Descartes' contribution, again, you're not understanding the whole that each of those philosophers point to, and you're fitting them into a different paradigm. So and Kant himself is partly responsible for this. And at one point, when he's discussing Plato in the Critique of Pure Reason, he says it's possible to understand an author, and he means Plato, better than that author understood himself. That is possible, I think. Otherwise, you could never recognise a mistake that anyone made. But, and I quote Strauss to this effect, to understand someone better than they understand themselves, you have to understand them as they understood themselves first. So, and that's our intention. We'll try and understand what Kant is doing, and then we can try and critique it. But the first thing is his own articulation of what he's doing. And just as to get a sense of the effect of what he thought he would have, I've got a couple of quotes. The first is from, and I'm going to try until the end of our discussion to only produce quotes from the Critique of Pure Reason, because we've got more than enough to look at. But this is from the Metaphysics of Morals, where he says, it sounds arrogant, conceited, and belittling of those who have not yet renounced their old system to assert that before the coming of the critical philosophy, i.e. before 1781 and my first edition of this Critique of Pure Reason, there was as yet no philosophy at all. Right? So if you can't teach a course on epistemology and say, oh, Kant has a contribution and Plato has a contribution, you have to make a decision, like who is correct in their whole articulation of how we relate to the world. You can't see it as a tradition in which there are small accretions of additions by Kant and then Hegel and then Nietzsche, and these views are completely in contradiction, and you need to understand them for yourself and then decide what you think is more persuasive. And we only have one criteria, which is our own experience, our ordinary experience. There's no non-arbitrary criteria outside of that. Now, our ordinary experience is made up of all kinds of, traditions, prejudices, opinions acquired from the internet, and so on. So that's a very ambiguous criteria, but it's the only one we have. Sorry, Fabio, did you want to?
Isn't it because all of the philosophers tried to create a system? They like Kant or
Well, Kant explicitly says, I am going to create a system.
Yeah.
Aristotle and Plato explicitly deny that they are creating a system.
Right, okay.
So that's another point of difference.
It seems like at this period, like Hegel comes with a system. They all attach to a system, to their system actually. So that's maybe why it could be problematic, and you have to negate the system of the other to make your valuable. Yeah.
So can people online hear that? Is it?
Don't forget the wands.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you could use the magic wand to thank you.
Showing your face when you speak.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kirsten.
So if I understand you, Fabio, you're suggesting that if each philosopher creates a system or an understanding of the whole, to do that they need to destroy the previous system or replace it. Is that?
Yeah, or make some change, really severe change to make it to make their system have a priority.
Yeah.
On the other. Anyway, more or less is what you were saying, each philosopher had to destroy the other understanding to be able to make their understanding the ultimate one.
Right. And there are different ways of doing that. So obviously, say Nietzsche, it is explicitly you must destroy the previous understanding to create the new one. Whereas in Aristotle's case, he is saying, because I love Plato, but and we love the truth more than we love each other, therefore I'm going to criticize Plato. And so that's a friendship in which requires him to criticize his teacher. But it's still the same activity. He's replacing what Plato taught with what he taught. Yeah. So but there are different ways of approaching that. But yeah, absolutely. But what I think we're agreeing with is that you can't look at these as neutral contributions to a intellectual discipline. What they are is mutually contradictory expositions of our whole existence. And we, even as, just readers of the text, need to decide, does it make sense? Does this make more sense? We can't just read it neutrally as an accretion to some intellectual discipline. Yeah.
Just as I was reading the preface you asked us to read, and I find a lot of where Kant was putting things, was presenting his case. Actually, I could see some similarity with Hegel when he's trying to put his case into action. So it's pretty clear that I'm not. It's pretty clear that Hegel took a lot of Kant. He took a lot of his research into account.
Yeah.
For his own system.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that first two lines, we've read our first two lines of Kant, where he suggests that there was no philosophy as yet. And so he's denying that you can teach a course from Plato to Nietzsche, no, there's a decisive difference between genuine philosophy and errors. Right? Now, the entire book finishes with the next paragraph, where he says, the critical path alone is still open. The critical path is a reference to the title, The Critique of Pure Reason. So reason, which in the Enlightenment is the principle of guidance in theory and practice. Reason replaces the tradition, religion, the philosophical tradition, and so on. Right? He subjects that guide itself to a critique. Right? And that's what he means by the critical path. So if the reader has had pleasure and patience in travelling along in my company, then he can now judge if it pleases him to contribute his part to making this footpath into a highway, whether or not that which many centuries could not accomplish might not be attained even before the end of the present one, that is, by 1800. Right? Namely, to bring human reason to full satisfaction in that which has always, but until now vainly, occupied its lust for knowledge. And it's interesting, he uses lust for knowledge because he is not praising the desire for knowledge in all respects. In fact, part of the critique of pure reason is to say there are theoretical satisfactions that don't exist, and we must forbid them. Right? Now, this is the difficulty in principle of, if you develop an Enlightenment thought, you're going to expose people to the truth and you're going to ask people to live by the truth, you must then forbid error. So there's a great openness and a great closing at the same time. And I'm not saying that as a criticism, this is what he says, as we'll see. Now, I've got a slightly rhetorical remark that the only possibilities for the reader are subservient worker on the new paradigm, or some form of ignorant reaction to it. That's what that last paragraph says. If you're persuaded by my account, then you should be working as on the paradigm in a subordinate capacity, because I've laid out the path. You're not going to find your own path. You're going to help develop this path. So that's one, or you could ignorantly react against it the way I am by trying to read Plato or something. Those are the two alternatives. Okay, so, and there are two things that are important from my point of view, which is a particular point of view influenced by classical thought, and I've just summarised these very briefly. One, in opposition to classical philosophy, an Enlightenment teaching must be, in principle, intelligible to every human being. That's the opposite of what Plato and Aristotle teach. They teach that the majority of human beings will understand things through imagery and analogy, but they won't be philosophically inclined. It's just people have different capacities and different inclinations, and what Kant refers to there as the lust for knowledge is rare. So it's just not something that most people will be interested in. But if you're teaching that a society, not just some handful of individuals, a society can live in the light of the truth, then the purpose of that philosophy, the end, has to be universally intelligible. Second, there can't be any mysteries remaining in principle, and together with the positive construction of the philosophy, there must be defensive outworks. And the way I put that is the intellectual equivalent of the execution of the King of France, say, a couple of years after the second edition, is produced together with the Committee of Public Safety. That is the forbidding of thoughts that don't agree with the new paradigm. And just to quote Kant, if objections are raised against the new teaching, he says, we must search them out like old but unexpired claims in order to ground perpetual peace, a title of one of his more famous essays, right? Perpetual peace based upon the spreading of the Enlightenment teaching that he propounded, on their annihilation. Right? So we must annihilate doubt. So it's a very delicate operation. If you're going to be an Enlightenment teacher, You have to somehow be so persuasive on your positive teaching, but you have to defend that teaching. And that accounts for some of the difficulties in reading Kant, because he's proposing something new, at the same time he's defending it with an extremely intricate argument. Okay, now over the page. Now, sorry, I'm just having a quick look at some remarks in the chat. And yes. So, in the first preface, which we want to get to shortly, Kant refers to metaphysics as a field of battle. And that's the field on which he begins this critique. For him, metaphysics consists of three principal theses. One, there is human freedom, that is, human beings can choose what to do in a way that you can judge morally. Right? Human freedom. Two, the question of whether or not there is a human soul that's immortal. Three, whether or not there is a God. Now, these are not, for example, Plato's or Aristotle's questions. They got nothing to do with the metaphysics of Aristotle at all. The question of being qua being, that's not here. That's the central question of Aristotle's metaphysics. What does it mean to be? Okay. These questions are clearly derived from medieval theology and modern philosophy. The question of whether or not a human being is compelled to do what they do in the same way that one billiard ball compels another billiard ball to move, that sort of mechanical causation. If human beings follow the same mechanical causation, then there's no free will and no moral choice. But that's not a question for Plato or Aristotle. They touch on it, but it's just not of importance because they don't take that mechanical model to be the paradigm for knowledge. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a modern question. Whether or not the soul is immortal and there is a God, those are clearly post-Christian questions. Then doesn't exist in Plato and Aristotle. There are reflections about the first principles, and they call those first principles divine, but there's no such thing as an acting God. They actually argue against that in detail. That's in Plato and Aristotle. So what I want to say, I'm not praising or blaming any aspect of these different thinkers. I'm just saying that to understand modern philosophers like Kant, we have to understand that they've built what appears to be a radically new thing out of theological and philosophical commitments, beliefs, thoughts, that don't exist in the tradition of classical philosophy and that come from modern science and they come from Christianity. So if you're going to agree or disagree, you just need to be aware of that, aware of what you're attacking or defending.
Just quickly, Martin. I noticed in the first edition preface, there's a short passage at I think 14, where Kant's defending himself against the perception the reader might have that he's immodest or pretentious, and he contrasts that with those who pretend to prove the simple nature of the soul or the necessity of a first beginning of the world, which I take to be him very subtly remarking on Aristotle. So it seems like he's aware that they're working on other questions as well, but then reframes it to the Christian sort of Aquinas reading.
Well, we'll get there. Well, I think that was one of the passages we're going to. Hopefully, we'll get to read. But that's a helpful passage for how it's a combination of both, because the simple nature of the soul, you could say that is Aristotelian, because he is saying that the human psyche is the form of the body. That is, it's the unity of the body, its ability to act as a whole. The fact that we, eat, walk as a whole. We're not doing that as a collection of parts. Something is animating us, and whatever is animating us is what he calls the psyche, and which in Latin is anima, what animates you. Right? That's got nothing to do with I'm not criticizing or praising this, but it's got nothing to do with the notion of an eternal soul. There's one remark at the end of Book 1 of De Anima by Aristotle where he says that the mind, if anything, would be separable from the body. And Aquinas assimilates that to his Christian teaching and says, yes, that's the soul that is separable from the body. And Aquinas, as a Christian, teaches that the soul is immortal. But that's an illustration of my point. He is taking a Christian view of a philosophical teaching as his beginning point to criticize. He's not beginning with other philosophers like Plato or Aristotle. And that's important if you want to understand, to defend or criticize Kant. But I hope we'll read that passage because that's of interest. Fabio?
Yes, so, the idea that Kant has about the soul is related to a Christian idea of the soul.
I'm saying that I would suggest that he begins his critique with notions that are specifically a mix of philosophy and Christianity. Yeah, would that be?
Yeah, because lately with Brett we were following another course, and the person was talking about Augustine.
Yep.
And what you understood after about Augustine, it seems like Augustine made a tabula rasa, and because he treated like Plato and the ancient philosophy as like more or less kind of ignorance. And so it seems like he came by and he made tabula rasa and he installed the Christian Christian philosophy.
Yeah, but he's. I mean, definitely, Augustine as a Christian sees Plato and Aristotle as ignorant of the most important things.
Yeah,
right, but he does use a lot of Plato's teaching in his own, in a subordinate capacity. Similar to Aquinas, who is extremely generous to Aristotle as the knower of the world, the authority, the philosopher. But philosophy is still subordinate to theology. So, very sympathetic, but in both cases, like Augustine, I think is sympathetic to Plato in some ways. But you're right, in the decisive sense, they're ignorant of Augustine, in his understanding, his experience of revelation that Plato and Aristotle haven't. Okay, so now to get closer to the book, right? There's two aspects to Kant's thought: science, morality, right? And there are two famous passages where he says that he was set on his path that led from these various works that he produced in his earlier life to the path of critique and the critique of pure reason. And one of the people who set him on his path was Rousseau, and that's fundamental because it set him on the path of what is the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of his whole existence. That's much more important than the second one, which is Hume. Hume raises a problem about modern science and its effect upon both science itself and morality. And we'll come to that problem. Now, when I was going through undergrad and graduate school and so on, that was always the major theme. Hume poses a question and Kant tries to solve that question. But that's, again, this focus on the first half of the Critique of Pure Reason and not the second half. In the second half, the second part, which is much smaller than the first part, there's the second chapter in the second part is called the Canon of Pure Reason. Canon is a Greek word that means a ruler, right? And it comes to mean a principle or the purpose for something which you use, the standard, right? So the whole book, the Critique of Pure Reason, is fundamentally about this capacity for reason. And in the second part, towards the end, there's a chapter that tells you how to use your reason correctly. It's almost never discussed. That's the purpose of the whole book. Okay, this is my complaint with the literature. You have to understand the strategy of the book. And I understand that by page 824 you're exhausted. We all are. But this is the purpose of the book. So that's what we'll try and focus on as we go. Okay, so therefore I think that the effect of Rousseau was more important than than Hume on Kant. There's an unpublished note which are called reflections in the literature, and you'll often see R14012 or something, and this refers to an unpublished note by Kant. And this one was cited in the introduction to the works on practical philosophy in that Cambridge edition of the works of Kant. And I'll read it now. So this is, we're on page 4. So after Rousseau, the end of philosophy and the denial of theory. So this is Kant. I am an inquirer by inclination. I feel a consuming thirst for knowledge. And like before, he said lust for knowledge. So we have natural inclinations, and he's going to end up saying morality requires you to control your lust, including your lust for knowledge. It's not so much your lust for something that makes you shoplift. That's not the main. The main problem is that you want to know things that can't be known. Right? I felt a consuming thirst for knowledge, the unrest which goes with the desire to progress in it, and satisfaction at every advance in it. So that could be suitably modified, written by Aristotle. Like the purpose of life is understanding and self-understanding. There are other purposes, like we have to win this war, we have to maintain an economy, or whatever it is. Those are secondary. Those are for the sake of the first purpose, right? There was a time when I believed this constituted the honour of humanity, and I despised the people who know nothing. Right? Now that's harsh, but it's not a million miles from Plato or Aristotle. Right? They don't despise the people. They try and leave a beneficent political teaching, but they haven't orientated their philosophy to the ends of the people, but on what they think is the truth. Okay, so far, Kant sounds like that reflected through a certain mirror. Now, Rousseau set me right about this. This binding prejudice disappeared. I learned to honour humanity, and I would find myself more useless than the common labourer if I did not believe that this attitude of mine can give worth to all others in establishing the rights of humanity. So the whole intellectual apparatus that he is building is designed to further the rights of humanity, the universal goal of humanity. And that's a new goal for philosophy, given it beginning with Bacon. Right? And if you want to read an extremely helpful summary, go to the end of Book 1 of the New Organon by Bacon, Book 1, section 128. And he is there critiquing Machiavelli implicitly that the highest goal is not political power, whether in your own state or over other states, but the power or the fame that accrues to the person who makes a method that allows people to make other scientific methods that will relieve man's estate. Right? So that's a universal humanitarian goal. And then you see the echo of that in part 6 of Descartes' Discourse on Method, where he says, my science is a practical science that will make us masters and possessors of nature. So science for the sake of power over nature. That's a universal goal and instituted by Bacon. But it's our goal. Like when people are much less confident about science now, but there used to be, the phrase, the conquering of nature or the possession of nature. These used to sound good to people because that was what our science was doing. It's eliminating disease, increasing wealth, increasing health, and so on. Okay, now, so we have a universal end to the whole philosophy. Now that raises questions, particularly for people like Henry Allison who care about the epistemology. What is the connection between the complicated metaphysical apparatus and this universal end? And the answer is given at the end of the book. So we're going to skip most of the book and get there. Okay, so that's the end of philosophy, and the end of something is what governs everything else you do about it. Once you choose to do something, everything else is subordinate to that end. How you get there, what instruments you want to use, conducting whatever it is you're doing, and so on. Everything else is subordinate to the end. Okay, now for Hume, who is much more widely recognised as being important to Kant's thought. And again, I'm going to proceed with quotes from Kant. Now, this is the bottom of page 4 of the handout. And these quotes come from a work called the Prolegomena to any metaphysics that will come forward as a science, which he wrote 3 or 4 years after he wrote the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And he wrote it, again, because there are still some fools who didn't agree with his, or didn't understand his view. And so it is a slightly easier to read. And it's 400 pages shorter. Okay, so I'll read through this though, because I think this is helpful. So, since the essays of Locke and Leibniz, or rather since the rise of metaphysics, as far as the history of it reaches, no event has occurred that could have been more decisive with respect to the fate of this science than the attack made upon it by David Hume. Okay, so that's, again, that's subordinate to the end of reason as a whole. But within the field of metaphysics, nothing has been as important as Hume since Aristotle. That's what he's saying. Hume started mainly from a single but important concept in metaphysics, namely that of the connection of cause and effect, and of course also its derivative concepts of force and action, etc., and called upon reason, which pretends to have generated this concept in her womb, to give him an account of by what right she thinks. That something could be so constituted that, if it is posited, something else necessarily must thereby be posited as well, for that is what the concept of cause says. He indisputably proved that it is wholly impossible for reason to think such a connection a priori and from concepts. And because this connection contains necessity, and it is simply not to be seen how it could be that because something is, something else necessarily must also be, and therefore how the concept of such a connection could be introduced a priori. Now, I don't know if you've done an introductory course somewhere on modern philosophy, you'll probably read a passage where Hume is saying that if you look at one billiard ball hitting another, what do you see? Well, the colours, the movement. You don't see the concept cause. Right? So where does our notion that the motion of the first billiard ball causes the second one come from? It's just the fact that we usually see that. It's just habit. But habit is custom. Things can change their custom. There's no necessity. It's not universally the case that this... You can't see something in those two billiard balls that indicates to you that this must necessarily always be the case. Which doesn't seem wildly implausible to suggest that. Now, but if that's true, if it's only custom that gives us the notion of cause and effect, then science is out. There is no science, because science depends upon the things that are both A, necessary. It's not that sometimes the billiard ball will go this way. If only sometimes it does, then physics is out, engineering is out, and so on. And also, science is necessary and universal, right? So if we're conducting the same experiment in China or in Bangladesh or wherever, we should get the same results. And that was the apparent glory of modern science, that it didn't matter what background you came from, it didn't matter what country or under what regime you were doing it, the results could be replicated, right? And they were universally accepted. So if there's no necessity and no universality in the key concept of science, then science is out. Right? So that's the threat. That's the question that Hume poses for science according to Kant. Okay, so I'll finish this paragraph. So from this he concluded that reason completely and fully deceives herself with this concept, falsely taking it for her own child when it is really nothing but a bastard of the imagination, which, impregnated by experience and having brought certain representations under the law of association, i.e. habit, passes off the resulting subjective necessity, i.e. habit, for an objective necessity from insight. So we have no genuine insight into a notion of causality from the empirical experience of seeing things move, right? So instead of that being an objective necessity that we have insight into, It's a subjective necessity, that is, it's formed by the fact that we frequently see these things occurring together. But that means it's not science, right? It's a habit like any other habit that we have. Right. Now, in the next paragraph is the famous quote from the Prolegomena that is frequently cited in the textbooks. I frequently admit that the remembrance of David Hume was the very thing that many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumbers and gave a completely different direction to my researches in the field of speculative philosophy, theoretical philosophy. I was very far from listening to him with respect to his conclusions, right? Because he wants to save science, right? Now, I won't spend too much more time on this, but I want to introduce just a little bit more of Hume, just to try and bring out this fact that there are two sides. Kant is fighting a war on two fronts. He's trying to preserve science as something from which we can get necessary and universal results. He also wants to preserve morality from science, from a reductive kind of science. And to bring that out, I've reproduced this quote here from Hume's treatise, which Kant doesn't cite. So this doesn't have the authority of the other citations of Rousseau and Hume. This is just Hume, and Kant, I can't recall any place where he actually cites this passage, but I think it brings out something that's helpful. And in this passage from the treatise, so the second long quote by Hume, he is trying to argue that moral distinctions, our notions of better or worse, immoral, moral, vicious, virtuous, are not derived from reason. Therefore, you can't reason about them. Right? So that's a denial of the philosophical tradition back to Socrates, who is arguing that we can reason about our ends. Yeah. So, and Hume is a very vivid writer. He's much less boring than certain German metaphysicians we could mention. And as we'll see. Okay, so we're in the middle of an argument. If we start from the third line down, this is the second part of our argument. If it can be made evident, we may conclude morality is not an object of reason. Okay, but can there be any difficulty in proving that vice and virtues are not matters of fact, whose existence we can infer by reason? Take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Okay, a murder. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you will find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. So you see someone being murdered, and there's no matter of fact about that murder that is bad or good. Good and bad are sentimental reactions, but they're not matters of fact. Now, the immediate response should be, that's a very narrow notion of what a fact is. But it's the notion of fact that derives from Newtonian physics, right? So it has some validity if you take that model. Okay, so you never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation, which arises in you, not from towards the action, not from the action. Right? Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object. So that when you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature, you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colours, heat and cold, which, according to modern philosophy, are not qualities in objects, but perceptions in the mind. So this was a common teaching at the time. The cold, the heat, the colour is not in the thing, it's in the interaction of your sensory apparatus and the thing. As opposed to Aristotle, He says that the fundamental thing is an independent object, a human being, an artifact like a book or a table or a computer, things that have relative independence from one another with certain attributes, colour, place, good and bad, functioning computer, non-functioning computer, excellent human being, not so excellent human being, and so on. But those are the real categories of the actual beings. But in this view, that's all out. Right? That's an aspect of perception. And this discovery in morals, like that other in physics, is to be regarded as a considerable advancement of the speculative sciences, though, like that too, it has little or no influence on practice. Now that's insane. You can't think that the truth is there's nothing good or bad, beautiful, ugly, noble, base, just, unjust. You can't think in truth none of those things have meaning and that not affect practice. Now Kant, to his credit, is extremely well aware of that, and his whole project is devoted to preserving practice from that notion. Preserving morality from that notion. Morality is a very narrow notion of practice, but he sees the problem. Right. Now, that's probably enough to begin with, so we probably should have a break. Then we'll come back and we'll just start to read the book. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the motto, and then we'll just read some parts of the prefaces. Did anyone have any immediate question before we stop?
I have one question.
Please, can you grab that stick over there? Thank you. Thank you.
I have the Penguin edition of the critique.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? Is it worth plunging into that, or?
Well, as far as I'm aware, they have two different translations. One from, I think, Meiklejohn from the 19th century, and one much more recent. I don't know which
The more
one.
recent one.
Okay, and does it have the marginal numbers?
I don't know.
Okay, that would be the most helpful thing, just because we can refer to like A13 or if it's a recent one, it should have that. So that should be fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin.
We can refer to this. Yeah. It's just that when I read something, it'll be from this edition. Anything else that? Talia?
Actually, you know, like maybe if you, I don't know much about Aristotle, so I can say, but we've been reading Plato.
Yeah.
And I think for Plato, I don't think, I think Plato brings back the body into his account of philosophy. So
Brings back
the body. So he always talk about the mind or the soul and the body.
Yep.
So more or less what Hume is saying here, that it's a matter of feeling.
Yeah.
I think Plato does that.
Doubts that.
It does that.
Yeah, I think completely denies that. Like for him, the phenomena. So we all agree that we begin with phenomena. The word phenomena means what appears to us. Mm. So the phenomena could be 7 things or someone being murdered, or so for Plato, the phenomena of someone being unjustly attacked is that it's an act of injustice. Like that's the most manifest thing, as well as the body, right? The bodies in this particular configuration have a certain meaning that our mind can have insight into. Whereas Hume is saying, no, that's not an insight, that's a projection of your sentiments. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm saying that Plato relate to this sentiment.
He
relate to this sentiment, to this feeling. You know, and it doesn't, the body is not only a projection.
Right.
You see what I mean? So I'm saying that Plato has an insight of my understanding.
But Plato is definitely not saying that it's just your sentiment. Yeah. He is saying there's an aspect of intellectual awareness of the injustice.
Like if we both saw the murder, there'd be an expectation we both feel the same way. But with Hume, you're
that's what I'm. Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I think Plato's got like a personal insight, like that the person itself is different from another person, because it relates to the feeling of the person, and so it doesn't stick to the body or to the image of the murder.
Yeah.
It sticks to the feeling that the person has about the murder.
I would like to slightly rephrase that, and then you see if you agree.
Yeah.
But because this is an extremely important difference between Plato and Aristotle and Kant. The difference is not the sentiment, but the insight, and that means that there's an intellectual awareness of acts that are better or worse. Now, we may all end up completely disagreeing about it because of our habits, our upbringing, and so on, but there is an act of intellectual awareness of the character of the viciousness or virtuousness of an act. And that means that the sentiment may modify that, but that aspect of the mind being aware of the body in a certain configuration, having a certain meaning, that's what Kant and most of modern philosophy denies. Right? Like the matter of fact is the body's moving in motion according to natural law. That's what Hume is saying. That's the matter of fact. And so there's no matter of fact for your speculative or theoretical intelligence to be aware of that it's bad as opposed to good. Is that?
Yeah, I see what you mean, but so you don't give an evaluation. That you don't give an evaluation to the act. That's what you're saying.
You don't give an evaluation. You see in the act whether it's better or worse. But everyone's, because of their capacities, interests, upbringing, habits, people will end up articulating a different evaluation. But for Plato, in principle, we can all see that this is bad and this is good.
Yeah,
That as an intellectual act.
Yeah.
That's what's denied by Hume. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not sure that Plato is only referring it as an intellectual act.
I'm not saying only.
Yeah.
Because then you wouldn't act upon it if you didn't have any passions or sentiments going with it, right? But the reason why I'm labouring at you with this is because this is extremely important to understand what's going on with Kant and all of modern philosophy. I mentioned Descartes in the Sixth Discourse of Method. He says, when I was conducting my speculative or theoretical philosophy, I didn't feel the need to tell anyone about it because I just solved some problems that were satisfying to me. It was when I developed a practical philosophy, by which he means a philosophy that has an effect on the world, a practical, productive philosophy, and he means his physics, right? When I developed that, then I had to propagate this teaching. But that means the truth is the mathematical laws of bodies moving in space. Right? That's the truth of things. And then Hume is saying, well, if that's the truth of things, then there's no better or worse in truth. Right? There's no intellectual capacity to see what's better or worse. Whereas Aristotle and Plato began from the fact that it's impossible for us not to evaluate things as being better or worse. That's a healthy tree as opposed to a diseased tree. Here is a flourishing human being as opposed to someone who is extremely unhappy and oppressed or whatever. That things are always in a better or worse state. And that's what we feel, like we're in better or worse state, due to things that happened to us or things we've done. And so that's part of reality. Whereas Hume is saying, no, the truth is the mathematical physics, and therefore anything else is a projection of your emotions. Are we roughly agreeing? Or?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree, but I understand understand the difference between the modern and the ancient.
Yeah. But the only reason why I'm picking up on this one aspect of your suggestion is that this is it's extremely important that we understand the difference between theoretical or speculative and practical philosophy. And we're going to cover this many times, but the criticism of modern philosophy begins by saying there's no theoretical or speculative philosophy. There are no principles to know, and therefore Plato and Aristotle are out, right? it's practical philosophy to change the world for everyone's benefit. It's a humanitarian goal, which obviously in many respects has been effective and helpful, but it also has some bad aspects, and we need to understand all of it to evaluate that. Yeah, but that's the key, that there's no theoretical philosophy. Yeah.
Could I make?
Please.
What you're saying reminds me of, I think it was Galileo who talked about primary and secondary qualities.
Yes.
And it looks like this has come right up to what we're talking about today.
That's absolutely right.
That science has undercut classical philosophy.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, so by saying that there are primary qualities, those are the truth of the things in the things. And that's the laws of motion.
That's where isness is.
Yes, that's what is the case. The secondary qualities are the ones that we construct out of our impressions of the phenomena, but that means they're not in the phenomena. We're projecting them. At least that's what people like Hume come along and then say.
Does Hume see it as an advancement on science to distinguish these sentiments from insights?
Yes,
yeah.
that was his phrase in that passage, because yes, now we understand the truth. Yeah, and he says that won't cause any problems with practice, whereas I think Kant correctly sees that will cause immense problems with practice. If there's no truth to what you think is better or worse to do, then you won't be attached to it. You won't follow it. Yeah.
It's a kind of nihilism.
Yeah, it's an early expression of what becomes nihilism in Nietzsche, and yeah.
That's very interesting.
Well, thank you for those comments. Let's have a break for 10 minutes and come back.
On to more practical things.
So we'll just stick to the handout just for a couple of seconds, but we're going to look at actual Kantian writing, although we start with a quote from Bacon. So, and this is, I think, extremely important. So this page 6 of the handout. Now, it's extremely important because if you look at a history of science now, or a history of philosophy now, Bacon's role is not that large. Kant quotes Bacon because he recognises correctly that Bacon is absolutely decisive. And I mentioned why before. Bacon gives the end, the purpose to philosophy or science for modernity. He breaks from the main tradition of philosophy and science. He mentions Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and criticises them. He begins from where Machiavelli begins, with this new understanding of human excellence, and criticises Machiavelli as not being ambitious enough, and sets a new humanitarian end to philosophy. That's decisive. Descartes, who is the founder of modern philosophy, says that he followed, well, he doesn't say, but if you look at the commentaries on the Discourse on Method, they show that in his notes, Descartes follows Bacon in this decisive respect. What's the end of the new science? Descartes was more important for the actual practical establishment of natural law, but Bacon set the new end, and he made some preliminary discoveries. People often mock Bacon for not being that effective as a science, because I think he died because he got pneumonia after experimenting with freezing a chicken or something. Yeah, so people who like but he was decisively important. And if you look at the history of the Royal Academy, which was the womb for the modern sciences, it was established because of Bacon and so on. Anyway, so this comes from a work of Bacon's called the Great Instauration. Now, that instauration is a made-up word of installation and restoration. And that word is the key to the Enlightenment, because it takes some things from the tradition and makes them new. So it's not a completely new establishment, and it's not a restoration of ancient philosophy. Sometimes Bacon and Descartes and others pretend that they're re-establishing what the pre-Socratic philosophers like Empedocles and Democritus taught, but that's like a convenient fable. They're taking some elements of, for the main element they take is that you can reason about human life, or that reason is good. Now, no one establishes that at the same length as the classical philosophers, because for them, they're always aware of the competitor to reason, which is whatever gods my city believes in. So Socrates and Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle have to establish that reason can be a guide to human existence against its competitors. Whereas there is a tradition by the time of Bacon, and they can just take that more or less for granted. Okay, now, so this quote comes from the Great Instauration, and he says, "Of our own person, we will say nothing. But as to the subject matter with which we are concerned, we ask that men think of it not as an opinion, but as a work." Kant, towards the end of this book, says something very similar when he discusses the difference between an opinion and a conviction. A conviction is something that is an opinion that happens, that's true because he proved it, i.e. the Critique of Pure Reason, right? So he is claiming to have come to true convictions and produced a work for human ends, not another opinion to add to the latest pile of metaphysical opinions, right? And consider it erected not for any sect of ours or for our own good pleasure. So theory does not have it, there are no theoretical satisfactions in themselves. That's not important. But as the foundation of human utility and dignity. That could be Kant, that he wants to refound science and philosophy for the sake of human utility and dignity. Each individual equally then may reflect on it himself for his own part in the common interest. So you can be an underworker in my project, if you so wish. Further, each may well hope from our instauration that it claims nothing infinite and nothing beyond what is mortal. For in truth it prescribes only the end of infinite errors, and this is a legitimate end. So the argument over the legitimacy of the new science is something that Kant continues. He says we're going to put up a jury or a judge over reason. Right? His metaphors for philosophy tend to be battles and the law courts. Right? Whereas if you read Plato and Aristotle, the metaphors are often derived from games, friendship, as well as battles and war, because they're aware of that side as well. Okay, but that's important because he's agreeing with Bacon to the end, and he's recognising the importance of Bacon in settling the end of philosophy. And that's the key to the work as opposed to the epistemological parts. Sorry, did you want to?
Do you know where this quote is taken from?
Well, so the Great Instauration is one of Bacon's main incomplete works. We only have the first couple of books, but in the preface to that. So if you picked up, a collected works, it'd be definitely in there. Yeah.
And when Bacon says the subject matter with which we are concerned, what's the Great Instauration about?
We will establish the true science. Yeah. So as opposed to these Aristotelian fictions that there are essences and beings, we're going to establish the true science, which is not is a science. We would now say a science of natural laws, where Aristotle spoke of the forms of things. I said before, our immediate phenomena is that things are different in their character or their form, human being, artifact, and so on. For Aristotle, those are forms, and so the form is just a Latin translation of a Greek word that means the look. Things look different, and that's where we begin. Whereas Bacon is saying, no, the true science ignores that. That's the, quote, ordinary course of nature. Underlying that are what we now call natural laws that govern, for example, the heat in your body and my body, this tea, the sun. That's the same heat. So we can understand that heat and then manipulate how that heat works across different bodies. Whereas for Aristotle, no, the heat of a human being is different in quality from the heat of the sun. And so obviously that's an error. Right? So there is some truth to the universalizing aspect of modern science, but to ignore the immediate character of things as we experience them leads us into other areas. For example, treating animals like they're inanimate or human beings like they're animals. Like that specific difference gets elided. Does it make some sense? Okay, so yeah.
From what he says here, it says like instauration that it claims nothing infinite and nothing beyond. So it's not a philosophy of transcendence.
Yeah, that will come through. That's where he completely agrees that it's that which we can know is restricted to us as human beings, which is the starry heavens above and the moral law within. We'll get to that though, because that's the denial of anything transcendent whatsoever. There's no theoretical life. There are no theoretical principles, and so on.
Okay, great. And so Kant is following that.
Yes, this is why I think it's a really interesting quote, because line for line it reflects things that Kant is doing in a different way, a completely different tenor and different register and vocabulary, but very similar impetus. So that's the dedication. In the dedication to some unimportant civil servant, he just mentions in passing that his works are, quote, toil whose utility is great but distant, and hence it is wholly misjudged by vulgar eyes. Now that's not the denial of what I pointed out with the Rousseau quote, that the purpose of the whole teaching is universal utility, right? It's just that it's so complex that only a few people will A, take some pleasure in reading it, and B, understand it well enough to propagate it on a lower level, right? And that's the task of you people who've been, about that paragraph at the end of the book, if you've been persuaded, please go about popularising the true teaching, right? But the end is utility. Now, Kant appears to be the person who makes the strictest distinction between morality and utility, in a complete denial of classical philosophy. With the highest utility is happiness. The highest happiness is excellence. Excellence involves excellence in your behaviour towards other people. That's a secondary thing. So what we call morality. Okay? Kant totally denies that, and we've come to accept his denial, that there is utility and morality. Right? And that accounts for the current character of morality, which is incredibly boring, because it only tells you what not to do. It doesn't tell you what will make you happy. Which is the core of ancient moral teaching. Like if you just read the first few pages of Aristotle's Ethics, if you want to see an example of that.
That's not like a way of you go by the negative to say the positive, because this way you got like less possibility to make an error, and you got like more the root idea of it. You see what I mean? So
but Kant is explicitly saying that you'll have your own happiness, but that's merely what pleases you, right? So he's completely agreeing with Locke and Hume and so on that happiness is subjective. Right? He's going to argue against them that morality is objective, and the greatest, the end would be that we combine the both in a universal world state where morality is supported and rewarded and so on. And we combine both goods, the subjective happiness and the objective morality. But we'll come to this when we get to the canon.
Sorry, what is the distinction between morality and utility for Kant?
Utility is what pleases you.
Okay.
Yeah, what's useful, pleasant. And morality is what's right. And he reconfigures that, but he separates these, and that's accepted by Mill, who then argues for utility, that morality is utility. Yeah. But what I'm suggesting is that that utility is the goal, morality is an aspect of that goal. We'll come back to that, because morality is useful to the many, right? To use the classical expression. The many are attached to morality. And Plato and Aristotle, in some ways, they don't look down on that the way Nietzsche does, but in some ways they're as distant from the common morality as Nietzsche. But they don't despise it, because they think it's a reflection of the true understanding of human excellence. But they think, just one example, pleasure. So Aristotle, late in the Ethics, in the first book he pretends to despise pleasure and praise virtue. By the end of the Ethics, he says, pleasure is the bloom of excellence. So if you're doing something that's excellent, you should feel pleasure, because you're doing something that's fulfilling of your human nature. Okay, now, if we skip ahead to, where are we? Page 7. This is just the contents, and this has only appeared in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And I'm just going to point out some of the massive things. It doesn't include the prefaces, which we're going to read shortly. We're going to read some of. There is an introduction, and there are A and B introductions. We're only going to look at some of the B edition introduction. And there are two major divisions. The transcendental, and this is a word we have to understand, and we'll read Kant on that word soon. The transcendental doctrine of elements, so the elements of pure reason. Part 2, the transcendental doctrine of method, how you use the elements. Right? So that's the key part, which is not as widely commented on. And if you look in the transcendental doctrine of method, 1, discipline of pure reason. Discipline means punishment, curtailment, right? The disciplining of pure reason, of the giving reason borders here and no further. Second, canon of pure reason, the right use of pure reason, which is not in theory. There are no theoretical objects of pure reason. But there are moral uses of pure reason. We'll come to that. Then the architectonics, or the division of the sciences, and then a page and a half on the history of pure reason, which is a very striking title because Kant is the beginning of the notion, developed in some of his essays, not in this work at all, that the history is a dimension of human existence. Now, we talk like that all the time. People say, well, you can't say that, it's 2025, as if the standards for 25 years ago aren't the standards of today, or as if the whole character of human nature has changed. And that's become a cliche since 1830, the death of Haeckel. But it has its beginnings in some of the later essays of Kant.
What does architectonic mean?
It's a metaphor first used by Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he's discussing the arts and the sciences. So we have medicine and carpentry and so on and so forth. And he says each of these arts and sciences takes a certain aspect of what is the case of being or of human existence, and it deals with that aspect. But we need, just as we have when we build a house, we have various artisans. We have a carpenter and a plumber and so on. You have to have an architect to design the whole structure and order all of the other arts and sciences. And so in the same way, we need to have an architectonic science that orders all the other arts and sciences, so that orders, in Kant's case, aesthetics, metaphysics, morality, or in Aristotle's case, that orders the practical and productive sciences of politics and ethics and economics, and the theoretical sciences of biology, physics, and the psyche, the psychology. And so, it's the peak understanding, which must include self-understanding, because it orders the other arts and sciences in the light of human nature. And so that's, it's basically the structure of knowledge. Now,
just wondering why I didn't have a contents for the second edition.
I don't know, just to make it harder. Now, in the Cambridge edition, they have their own contents pages, and there's 7 pages of very intricate, and it does have an intricate structure which they've elucidated for us, which is extremely helpful. But he doesn't make it easy. Okay, now on this handout, I've reproduced a quote from another text, The Critique of Practical Reason, where Kant summarizes how he sees things. Now, I really very much want to read this and discuss it, but we're not going to have time to look at the prefaces. So maybe we do this next week, and now we go to the preface of The Critique of Pure Reason. But just because we do want to look at that, but there's some paragraphs that we absolutely need to get to. So the preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, A7, and I'm afraid I didn't bring copies of the Critique of Pure Reason, but if you happen to have any access to an electronic device, I sent that link to the PDF on the handout. But otherwise, I'll just read it and we'll go from there. So this is the first paragraph of the preface of A. And I'm going to read the first paragraph of both prefaces. So this preface: human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions that it is burdened with questions that it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason. So therefore, and what is that aspect of our cognition? Well, theoretical reason. And why cannot it answer the questions posed for it? Because there are no theoretical objects. Now, I do want to get to this political metaphor, just given the circumstances of the time that I pointed out. He said, beginning of the next paragraph, reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. Now, he then expresses that reason has continually gone back and forth and made no progress, right? And in the last sentence of that paragraph, he says, the battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. So that which, in the tradition, that's theoretical philosophy, the rational understanding of the highest principles of human existence. Okay? Now, next paragraph. There was a time when metaphysics was called the queen of all the sciences. Like if that's the architectonic, like if you have a ruler that rules all the other arts and sciences, that's the most important science, the science of being itself, right? So metaphysics was called the queen of all the sciences, and if the will be taken for the deed, it deserved this title of honour on account of the permanent importance of its object. But from Kant's point of view, it did not deserve this title because it had never achieved anything except controversy. Exactly the same discussion in the first part of Descartes' Discourse on Method. All of the previous people have produced just endless controversy, no works. Okay? Same as Bacon. Okay, so now in accordance with the fashion of the age, this age of enlightenment, right? The queen proves despised on all sides, and the matron, outcast and forsaken, mourns like Hecuba, Priam's wife at the fort of Troy, right? Greatest of all by race and birth, I am now cast out powerless. He agrees with the casting out, right? This queen and her king have false pretenders to the throne. So he agrees with this revolution, right? Next quote. In the beginning, under the administration of the dogmatists, Plato, now he takes a dogmatist to be anyone who teaches that there are theoretical truths about the human psyche, about God and so on, right? So that teaching is itself despotic and he wants it out. So he agrees with this revolution. And then we have another revolution, a practical one, in a few years' time. I just want to bring out how closely linked the apparently abstruse metaphysical discussion and practical politics are. Now, I think we might skip to the second preface, the B preface, which has some extremely important suggestions for us. Okay, so now Kant is never ever chastened, right? But reflecting on the fact that some stubborn and ignorant people don't understand his book, he writes this second preface to a bit more elucidated, helpfully for our purposes. So first paragraph again. So this is on page B7, and he says, whether or not the treatment of the cognitions belonging to the concern of reason travels the secure course of a science is something which can soon be judged by its success. Now, Aristotle would say, no, it can't. Like if someone has understood fully the secret wisdom of the cosmos, that has absolutely no effect on their ability to build a fence or to be famous in their city, or it's got no effect apart from their fulfillment of their natural capacity for understanding. Now, but that's not the Enlightenment teaching. You have to have universally visible ends. Okay? So Now, he's going to immediately say, now, if what pretends to be a science, like metaphysics, is constantly making progress and then falling back, and if there's no unanimity about it, then it's not a science. In the same way that Newton was able to compel universal unanimity that this is the correct understanding of the solar system, with our one force of gravity and our 3 laws of motion and so on. That compelled almost universal assent. So metaphysics hasn't been able to do that, so metaphysics is a failure as a science. Now this second preface is about what does it mean to enter onto what he's saying here, the secure course of a science. First example, logic. So that's the next paragraph. From the earliest times, logic has travelled this secure course. That it has can be seen by the fact that it never took a backward step, and you can't add anything to it now. Now, logicians in the 20th century would say, no, since Frege and Russell, science has made these various developments and so on. And then Kantian scholars will argue and say they haven't been decisive, it's the same thing with a different terminology and so on. I don't know, and I'm not particularly concerned about that argument. But this is his example. A science that achieves success doesn't take a backward step, it's progressive, right? And it achieves unanimity, which Aristotle's logic kind of had for a couple of thousand years. So that's the first example. But that's not a theoretical science because it has no object apart from thought itself, right? So if you say, if you do intro to logic, if I remember this correctly, someone will write on the board, if A, then B. A, line, conclusion, B. So if, to use an Aristotelian example, if you are an animal, then you are mortal. Human beings are animals, therefore human beings are mortal. Sometimes in the textbooks they say Socrates is a human being and therefore Socrates is mortal, but that's an individual thing. Aristotle was only concerned with the kinds. But in either case, if A then B, if A is the case, then B necessarily follows. And that's a sign that gives us a fact merely through a process of reasoning. And that excites some people because they think we can therefore learn from reason. Is anyone else developing frostbite? Or... No, I'm just curious because...
Yeah, you've got the spot.
Okay. I think maybe, yeah. I'm indifferent to merely bodily effects, but my concern for the many and their comfort. Okay, so that's the first example. But then over the page, just before B10 in the margin, insofar as there is to be reason in these sciences, something in them must be cognized a priori, and this cognition relate to its object in either of 2 ways, either merely determining the object and its concept, which must be given from elsewhere, or else making the object actual. Now a typical, transparent, easy to understand Kantian sentence. So what he's saying is that if there is to be a science of something, if we're to have knowledge of some kind of an object, then we must have certain and universal knowledge of things of that kind. Certain and universal. Those are the 2 criteria. Right? Now, that can't happen empirically. In Hume, like Hume says, he agrees with Hume, if we have only our sense data, we will never have a science. Right? Because you'll never perceive sensibly, through the eyes, through the sense of touch, the notion of causation as being a universal and necessary thing, concept, right? That's not something you can see. All you can have is the habit of seeing together this billiard ball and that billiard ball and so on. So therefore he is saying if there is to be a science, there must be principles that are recognized, and he uses this term of art, a priori, which just means from beforehand, from before the sense experience. Now, he's immediately going to say in the introduction, by before, I don't mean necessarily in time. So he says, I agree with everyone who says that our experience of the world comes through the senses. I completely agree with that temporally. Like in time, the first thing is that we're exposed to the world and we take it in. But not in time, but in principle, we can't experience that world unless we organise it into concepts. And that organising into concepts happens, unconsciously, but it's necessary for our experience. It's necessary also for there to be a science. If things aren't organised according to necessary and universal laws, then there is no science. But he's saying, on the basis of our ordinary experience, there is science, because things happen in an organised and universal and necessary fashion. But in two ways. They must be cognised a priori, and this cognition can relate to its object, either determining the object in its concept that comes from elsewhere. Now, that means the objects of physics, of things, we have sense perception, and the understanding conceptualizes that sense perception. In morality, we make the object, we make the moral principle. Now, what that might even mean, we have to learn. Like that will come from all of our reading together. I want to come down to the next paragraph where he says, mathematics and physics are the two theoretical cognitions, theoretical as opposed to practical. Right? Theoretical cognitions of reason that are supposed to determine their objects a priori. The former entirely purely. So in mathematics, there is no sensed object. Obviously, we use diagrams and numbers all the time, and he discusses this at length in the first part of the second part of the whole book, in the discipline of pure reason. There's an extensive discussion of mathematics, which is in itself of great interest. But the objects of mathematics, that appears to be the science where things are necessary and universal. 2 and 2 is 4 here, and in Persia, and in Athens, etc. Yeah?
No longer in Washington.
It depends. Mathematics and physics are the two theoretical cognitions of reason that are supposed to determine their objects a priori. The former entirely purely. So mathematics determines its objects entirely purely of sense perception. Right? The latter, even if we need the sense perception of diagrams to help us understand it, the latter, physics, at least in part purely, but also following the standard sources of cognition other than reason. That is, physics is about the motion of bodies, and you have to sense the body to conduct your experiment. So we have two sciences. Now, it's interesting to see how he discusses these sciences, because they're going to be the model for metaphysics. Right? And that's where I think the key point of disagreeing with Kant would have to begin, that he accepts these models which are questionable in various ways, but we'll come to that later. So mathematics has, from the earliest times to which the history of human reason reaches, in that admirable people, the Greeks, travelled the secure path of a science, and he's thinking mainly of Euclid, which compelled universal assent, like Newton, for thousands of years. Now, in the last two lines, he says, its transformation so first of all, he says, amongst the other people, like we know there are complicated mathematical calculations and measurements, astronomical measurements among the Babylonians and the Egyptians, but it wasn't a science, because it wasn't set down with axioms and postulates and theorems. It wasn't fully understood. The grounds of it weren't understood until Euclid, and Euclid comes from the school of Plato. Right? But until that happened, it wasn't a science. This is his claim. Right? Now, he says that there was a revolution brought about by the happy inspiration of a single man, and then over the page, we're still on B11. We're still on B11, in an attempt from which the road to be taken onward could no longer be missed, and so on and so forth. I want to press on. So that's mathematics, right? Next paragraph, this is in B12, about halfway down the page of this text. It took natural science much longer to find the highway of science, to become a genuine science. For it is only about 1.5 centuries since the suggestion of the ingenious Francis Bacon partly occasioned this discovery and partly further stimulated it. So there was already a Kepler and a Copernicus, but there wasn't yet a Bacon to really give clarity to what a science means, to what a natural law is. So again, this is Kant giving a lot of credit to Bacon, I think quite rightly, but in ways that are not normally now done. That credit is now normally given to Leibniz and Descartes. Okay, so he says, here I will consider natural science only insofar as it is grounded on empirical principles, which he's going to deny, right? But this is a very important passage for what's going on with Kant, and so we'll read this paragraph from B12 until it goes over the page onto B13, because then he gets down to metaphysics. So when Galileo rolled balls of a weight chosen by himself down an inclined plane, or when Torricelli made the air bear a weight that he had previously thought to be equal to that of a known column of water, or when in a later time Stahl changed metals into calx and then changed the latter back into metal by first removing something and then putting it back again, a light dawned. Second time he's used that phrase. The first was with the person who invented mathematics in Greece. A light dawned on all those who study nature. They comprehended that reason has insight only into what it itself produces according to its own design, that it must take the lead with principles for its judgments according to constant laws and compel nature to answer its questions rather than letting nature guide its movements by keeping reason, as it were, in leading strings. So just to comment on that. So what he's saying is, in your modern scientific experiment, you are presuming that there is an underlying material substance, doesn't matter, we don't know anything about it, right? But it obeys natural law, necessary and universal natural law. That's opposed to our ordinary experience of things. Human beings don't obey natural laws, kangaroos don't obey natural laws, right? So the ordinary, this is what Bacon calls the ordinary course of nature. Things come to us in kinds. This is the Aristotelian view. And your knowledge of something is relative to that kind. Kangaroos have this kind of behavior and so on. The new understanding is that I ignore that, right? And I impose upon this phenomena the notion that there is a universal law and I can control the matter underlying a kangaroo and a rock in the same way, right? I may have to kill the kangaroo in order to get it to behave in the same way as rolling the weights down the incline, right? And then I might have to encase the kangaroo in concrete so that it rolls and that friction doesn't become a problem with my experiment and so on. So this is what Bacon calls torturing nature, right? When he says compelling nature to answer its questions, that's a judge torturing a witness to get the truth, right? I'm just bringing out this aspect, this underlying harshness, because I think it's important. So then he says, for otherwise accidental observations made according to no previously designed plan can never connect up into a necessary law, which is yet what reason seeks and requires. Now this is something that I think is very illuminating, because there's no such thing as a natural law in Plato and Aristotle. They completely deny the very notion of there being a natural law. The whole teaching is law as opposed to nature, right? So the notion of a natural law only comes from this mix of philosophy and theology in the medieval period. That's accepted by and used in a radically different way, but it's the same thought that is used by certain key modern philosophers like Kant and Descartes, right? So my point in the handout is that, our whole intellectual cosmos is partly defined by thoughts that have a very particular background that we take just to be, like everyone in every community, just take to be natural. But they're not. They have a particular background which you may, if you were Christian, you might dispute them because you don't think that theology should be mixed with science. And if you're a devotee of philosophy, you might disagree that they should be combined because you don't want theology mixed up with your philosophy and so on. So there are all kinds of possible objections you could make, but that's the basis, the notion of a natural law. Okay. But so is that point a little bit clear that we must impose upon nature a paradigm if we are going to get to the truth? And what we are seeing in nature is what we ourselves have put there, or what reason itself has put there. That's what he's saying.
Is it maybe helpful to contrast with how Aristotle approached I guess we would call them natural sciences now? Like with biology, it was just observational. I think he never did any sort of closed system experiments or tortured nature to try to figure it out. It was just a typology of like, how does it seem to work based on observation rather than exploiting natural laws.
Yeah, so that's the difference is where Kant says here, for otherwise accidental observations made according to no previously designed plan. So Aristotle, it's not that he has no previously designed plan, but for him, the science of something depends upon the kind of being that it is. So if you read the history of animals in the first book, the question is there a science for all living things, or do we have to have a science for each kind of living thing? Because they are fundamentally different. Human beings have reason. All other animals have certain kinds of passions and so on. Or are they universal principles, not natural law? But yeah, so Aristotle takes himself to be guided to the principles of nature by the specific kinds of beings that we encounter. The notion of a natural law is that no, the truth is that which goes across all kinds. Right?
And how would one distinguish?
I don't want to go into Aristotle any more than we are currently doing, though. I want to read as much as possible of.
Just quickly, the distinction between universal principle and a natural law, if you could just explain that.
Well, a natural law is a principle that is effective no matter what the kind of being it is. Right? A natural principle is the principle of a natural being, but that principle is different. So in human beings, the principles of motion are reason, passion, and violence. Right? Whereas in a rock, it's only natural motion and violent motion. That is motion against its nature, which is to move downwards. So different beings have different principles. But we've actually reached 2:00, and we've read one paragraph. So now it wouldn't be a bad thing if we spent the 5 weeks making our way through the preface to edition B. That would be valuable. I would love, though, to make more progress and read different paragraphs. So what I suggest next week, if you have a chance to read the B preface, please do that. I've got in the schedule an insanely ambitious suggestion that we're going to read various other parts of the text, and I will try to comment on those. So preface B. And then, if you happen to be lying around and there's nothing on YouTube, and you read B 1 to 30 and B 33 to 73, that would be fantastic. But if you have a chance to read nothing because you're living an actual life, we will read things together and try and make sense of it together. So there's no necessity. Yeah, but that's just a suggestion.
It's just about the preface. All the numbers you gave is about the preface.
Do you have the list?
Yeah, so on that handout, there's some, and also just the preface to the second edition. That's what we'll discuss. But I'm hoping that we can, things will be intelligible if you don't have a chance to read anything, because we'll read it together. And I want to try and make ordinary language common sense out of what we read. If we can't, it's a failure. We have to be able. If you can't understand something in ordinary speech, it's a failure. We have to be able. So we'll try and do that ourselves. So whether or not you have a chance to look into things, but
Martin.
Yep. Yes, Peter.
I just want to say a really, really good session. I really appreciate you teaching this course. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I thought it was just going to be us. But we're going to have to share it with these other people. But yeah, no, I look forward to discussing with you, Peter. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next week, nobody else is allowed to attend except for Peter.
Okay.
It's great teaching. I love it.
Thanks for your attention. I'll speak to you next week. Thanks, Peter.